Universal Studios is a huge company, and one of their biggest draws to their theme parks each year is Halloween Horror Nights, a celebration of some of the best movies that Universal has ever made. I was able to attend the Hollywood version this year for press night, and it reminded me of Universal's history with the genre. Back when Walt Disney decided to make his first ever full-length animated feature, he bet everything he had on Snow White. And luckily for him, it paid off. When money was tight again by the end of World War II, Cinderella saved the company. It's pretty well known that princess stories are what saved Disney, and have dominated their lineup of films for the last few decades. But Universal was saved by a specific genre as well. My name is Josh Taylor, this is Modern Mouse, and today I want to talk about how the horror genre saved Universal Studios, and why they continue to celebrate it every year with Halloween Horror Nights. I'm a sucker for Halloween season, because I enjoy getting scared. I like wandering through a haunted house and having something pop out at me, or seeing some ghoulish figure off in the distance. Outside of Disney, one of my favorite things is classic monster movies. Growing up, I was always drawn to monsters. I felt that maybe if I could overcome the monsters on screen, then real life wouldn't be so scary. That idea isn't my own, and it's also not a new one either. During the Great Depression, Universal decided to make their own version of Dracula. It's probably the most famous version, with Bela Lugosi playing the title role. The movie became an international hit. On its $300,000 budget, it would end up making $700,000, and it became their most successful film of 1931. 9 months later, the studio released Frankenstein, starring Boris Karloff as the monster. On a similar budget, that movie made $1.3 million. All of this coming from a studio that had lost money in the years prior to Dracula. And Universal was no slouch to scares, since they had made The Hunchback of Notre Dame and The Phantom of the Opera, both starring Lon Chaney in the 1920s. But these new monster movies were catapulting Universal to new heights. In the years that followed, they continued to add to their collection of monsters, with The Mummy in 1932, The Invisible Man in 1933, and The Bride of Frankenstein in 1935. But 1936 became a pivotal year for Universal, with one film that wasn't a monster movie. Up to this point, Universal Studios had been a family-run business, with Carl Laemmle running it from its beginnings in 1912 all the way up till 1928, when he decided to pass the business along to his son, Carl Jr., not the burger restaurant. He would take the studio from small productions to grand-scale lavish movie making. He invested in sound and new cameras and big sound stages. The Universal lot had always been big in scale, but it was never big in scope until Jr. took over the business. His biggest production was a remake of 1929's Showboat. The original was a silent film that had sound dubbed on top of it and had reshoots also adding sound. The film was based on the 1926 novel and not the hugely popular Broadway musical that came after, so remaking the movie just made sense. They could capitalize on the popularity of the Broadway show for those who couldn't travel to see it, and could produce the film in full sound. The film's budget would inflate to nearly $1.2 million, and rather than pulling any kind of loans, Carl Jr., again, not the burger place, would finance the film himself, basically betting everything that he had, including the ownership of the studio. Carl gave the directing duties to James Whale, who had worked on Frankenstein, and hired as many of the original Broadway stars as possible to be in the movie. It was a critical hit and made a fair amount of money, but not enough to make up for the massive budget that had come from Laemmle's pocket. Therefore, he had to give up the studio, and Universal was no longer a family business. Over the next decade and a half, new owners would come and go, all trying to keep the business going. And all of them steered clear of big budget productions, rather leaning instead on what Universal had been known for, monster movies, and making them at a much cheaper production budget. Universal would continue to rehash characters like Dracula, Frankenstein, the Mummy, and the Invisible Man in a slew of sequel films. In 1941, they introduced the Wolfman, featuring Lon Chaney Jr., and in fact, he would continue to play the character in various movies through the rest of the 1940s, and was very proud to be the only monster movie actor to continue to play his role. Another act added to Universal's mix of the 1940s were radio comedy personalities Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, who were a powerhouse duo for Universal, making multiple movies a year. By the end of the 1940s, Universal combined their two most popular franchises, with the films Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein and Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man, which is teased as a sequel in the previous film. Universal's last classic monster movie character came from 1954's The Creature from the Black Lagoon. Written over the course of a decade by William Allen, the movie took notes from the classic story of Beauty and the Beast. When it was finally released, it created an entirely new genre of horror monster movies, based more in science fiction than classic literature. Movies like This Island Earth, or It Came from Outer Space, or The Deadly Mantis were big hits at Universal. It would be the director of The Creature from the Black Lagoon, Jack Arnold, who would sum up the success of the Universal monster movies when he said, "I think the only way you can get an audience to accept the impossible is to get them involved in the atmosphere." More than anything, the early horror movies from Universal Studios created an atmosphere that left audiences both intrigued and also repulsed. There's a safety in the fiction, but also a danger in the violence. It's this atmosphere to this day that still brings people to see a scary movie or to walk through a haunted house. By the 1950s, the studio had grown out of its struggle, and in 1952, the studio lot was sold to the Music Corporation of America, or MCA. That brought in a ton of new revenue, and by 1962, MCA had a complete buyout of Universal. They brought in new actors and directors and updated the studio lot to a state-of-the-art facility. It's hard to imagine Universal as a struggling studio, considering it's one of the biggest entertainment conglomerates running these days. But for many years, they relied on cheaply made monster movies to keep the studio afloat as different forms of management came and went. In present times, the monsters of the past have made new friends. Thanks to other smaller studios working with Universal, the company continues to celebrate their horror roots with a yearly theme park experience, which takes place in all of the Universal Studio theme parks worldwide. I've been fortunate enough to experience many years of Halloween Horror Nights in Hollywood. This year in particular, I was reminded of the studio's past, thanks to a maze called The Bride of Frankenstein Lives. It's featured alongside several other mazes, which are based off of movies like The Exorcist, Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the Netflix series The Haunting of Hill House. The beauty of Halloween Horror Nights, at least the Hollywood version, is that it sits right on the same lot where many of those films that helped save the company were made. Not only do you feel connected to the stories because these characters are right in front of you in a haunted house, but because you're standing on the same ground in which these films came to life. The same sound stages where these sets were built, where that atmosphere was first created. And I get it. It's a theme park. They're going to gladly sell me a ticket, overcharge me for some mediocre French fries, and try and sell me some souvenirs on my way out. But Horror Nights has never really felt like that. It doesn't feel like just a theme park experience, but it still feels like a celebration. Halloween Horror Nights is a toast to those classic monster movies that helped save a studio, and a good reminder of those stories that we hid our eyes from in the middle of the night when we weren't supposed to be watching. And it's a dream that these characters may never be forgotten. If this is your first time here, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel, and if you're interested in more Halloween type of content, I've got that coming down the pipeline as well, and you can check out another video right here from me, or learn the history of something else right here. But in the meantime, my friends, thank you for watching, and as always, keep moving forward.